Welcome, everybody. Sorry for the late start. We are actually still having a few technical difficulties. We're trying to get Antoine Half into the meeting. Hopefully, he'll be able to join us any second. Beyond that, I have Andrew Gold with me, who needs no introduction. He's a veteran now of our webinars, having actually participated in one on the future of oilfield services, which was very successful. So welcome, Andrew. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah. Today's topic, while we're waiting for Antoine, I will kind of dive into just a few brief opening remarks. But today's topic is really on methane. What is the oil and gas industry to do? It is increasingly coming under scrutiny. Methane emissions in particular. It is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. It is increasingly visible through new technology, either drones or satellites and other things that Andrew and Antoine will definitely speak to. And so addressing this potent greenhouse gas is becoming a significantly higher priority than it really ever has in the past. Just for context, it accounts for roughly 10% of total GHG emissions in the U.S. alone on a CO2 equivalent basis, and that's from the EPA's greenhouse gas inventory. Reducing or eliminating methane emissions is a critical step to the U.S. achieving any goal that it may put forth with regard to reducing methane emissions or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Some questions that will drive towards an answer in this webinar are really, how big is the problem? What is the historical context for methane and its regulation? Who is responsible and where do emissions occur? And what can be done ultimately to address? Now, as most of you probably are aware, the current administration rolled back some methane rules that were put in place during the Obama administration, and that drew an incredible amount of criticism. And the industry in general has responded in a variety of ways. A lot of companies have actually called for or called out against the methane rules rollback, while others have applauded it. So hopefully what we'll do today is sort of get into a discussion about why that's the case, why there's such a varied response to this, and ultimately what can be done as we move forward. So I think what we'll do, Andrew, I can pull the slides up, or if you want to run them, you're welcome to.
I can't. If you pull them up, Ken, and run them, I'll just tell you when I need you to flip. Okay.
No problem. I am going to do that right now. Okay.
Okay, so just to give a little context, myself and a group of other people about 6 years ago founded a satellite observation or an Earth observation company using satellite measurements. We initially focused on identifying exploration and production activity. We have a number of technologies in addition to satellite, which geolocation is one. 3D offset measurements to look at, for example, the height of coal stockpiles. Our initial success with this was basically in providing satellite measurements of inventory changes around the world. And in fact, we have the most comprehensive inventory measurement. We then moved on to emissions, and this was facilitated by the launch of a new European satellite, Sentinel-5P, which gave us the ability from space to look at very large methane leaks or clusters of methane leaks. And if you look at this slide, in fact, I don't have all the facts in my head, Ken, but I think this shows the leaks as measured for the year 2019. I can't give you the exact size of them, but you can see, for example, if you look at Russia, you see there's a track going off to the northeast. That is the Yamal pipeline, for example. So those are leaks on the Yamal pipeline. You can see the Permian very clearly on the map, and that is unconstrained flaring, basically methane associated with unconstrained flaring. If you look at Saudi Arabia, which is a country that's always captured its gas for use in domestic electricity, they in fact have very few methane leaks. It's quite remarkable. So basically, this satellite gives us the ability to look at large concentrations or clusters of leaks pretty much around the world. It is slightly weather constrained, but not very much. So if you go to the next one, Ben. So basically, methane emissions are out of control, and the 20-year warming potential is 84 times greater than CO2. You can see the increase in the concentration of methane is much greater than the increase of concentration of CO2 that we have. And as the satellite shows, it's very difficult, firstly, to measure emissions indirectly, as you can do with CO2. There has to be a direct measurement because it's invisible. And secondly, it can range, as the map showed previously, from a wide range of levels. So if you go to the next slide, Ken. So these are some examples. The first two are the ones I mentioned, the Yamal pipeline from Russia. You can see there are 56 detections, 1.8 megatons of CH4 a year. The Permian, 136 detections or 2.9 million tons of CH4 per year. And Algeria, 170 kilotons of CH4 per year. So these are, we're going to drill down now to specific examples. So if you can go forward, Ken, please. So this is a leak that we detected in Algeria following an incident that occurred on January the 2nd on a gas injector well, which was located about 30 kilometers from the city of Hassi Messaoud, which is the center of the Algerian oil field. Sonatrach mobilized the necessary means to control the leak in the well. The interesting thing here is that with wind direction and plume inversion, you can see on the left, firstly, we detected and quantified and identified the direction in which the plume was spreading. And the second is, and this was confirmed by geolocation and also coordination with Sonatrach, the attribution of the well to the leak to a specific well location. You can go forward, Ken. This is the gas pipeline in Russia. Interesting that we actually published this without talking to Gazprom, but Gazprom immediately confirmed it and actually sent us a lot of information about what they were doing to control it. Gazprom, of course, is extremely nervous about the fact that the EU, the European community, who is their biggest customer, is looking at imposing an import tax on natural gas linked to the GHG emissions that they can attribute to it. So they're very keen to send the message that they're doing their best to control these leaks. Next one, Ken. This is gas storage in California. This is some time ago, in fact, but this is a leak that went for about 3 days before it was really detected, and it was detected by complaints from the community. We can go back and look at the images before that. Had we, at that time, had our product, we could have, in fact, identified it at least 2 days before the residents started complaining. So the technology is very powerful in finding and attributing leaks to specific locations. Our aim is not to name and shame. Our aim is to help the industry to be able to identify where they have specific leaks, to allow them to move swiftly to repair them. And currently we are in advanced negotiations with 2 of the super majors who wish to actually have their leaks monitored on a regular basis in their operations going forward. Okay, Ken. So as Ken said, there are a number of technologies. They each have specific uses. So for example, the reason that our satellite technology is valuable is it is high frequency, low data, low high resolution, and above all, it has global scope. It can detect, it can quantify.
Well, it looks like we may have just lost Andrew. This is a heck of a day. He did warn me that his internet service provider, Xfinity, was warning him that in the area where he is, there are frequent outages. So I'm sure he will join us as soon as he can. He'll be back with us. There's a number of issues that both Anton and Andrew are more than qualified to address, and I was hoping to be able to steer a conversation through all of them. The one thing that I will highlight just while I have the air at the moment is the technology that Andrew has basically just highlighted with this presentation is quite remarkable. In fact, the ability to identify methane leaks anywhere in the world in real time is a very powerful tool. And if used appropriately, it can actually address concerns related to methane leaks in very short order. So point here is these are issues that are ultimately addressable. It really becomes a matter of how the technology is used and whether or not companies, national oil companies, governments, policymakers, et cetera, choose to take steps to address methane leaks. The long term is certainly uncertain, without a doubt. I think 2020 has taught us that, if nothing else. But as we look forward and start to think about where controls for greenhouse gas emissions ultimately can arise, I mentioned in my opening remarks that methane accounts for about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. as a whole. 75% of that is actually from oil and gas operations. So when we think about successful addressment of methane leaks, methane is a greenhouse gas. The oil and gas sector has a central role in dealing with this. Given some of the announcements by some major oil companies around the world, and of course we've heard about the announcements of companies such as BP, Equinor, Shell, et cetera. And Andrew just mentioned, without naming names, that they are in conversations with super majors for the product that they've been developing at Kairos. I would say, in general, there is a positive outlook with regard to addressing methane emissions and ultimately making a dent in the overall greenhouse gas emissions rates that we see around the world. The other thing that I will highlight that I thought was incredibly interesting is the density of methane emissions from the global picture that we saw. And I'll just pull that back up briefly to stimulate some conversation at the outset. What this highlights is it's not just a well issue. It's not just a well control issue. He mentioned pipeline infrastructure from Russia ultimately into Europe. You can see that in that cluster, that line, if you will, and addressing those, while different, has similar impacts. I mean, we have to talk about transport, we have to talk about production. Ultimately, measurement and monitoring are critical to achieving this aim. So, in all, I would suggest that the development of technology is actually facilitating the ability to address emissions in real time, and that's actually fantastic. So, as we move forward, the ability to utilize tools such as this is going to be incredibly powerful. So, Andrew, glad to see you made it back. I think I filled some.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The memorial internet is not behaving today.
I know. I gave the audience a download of that. So,
okay, thank you.
I think we're on this slide. I'll let you go ahead and take it. Take it from here.
Yeah, actually, I was just going to end on the drone and ground sensors, which is very good at small leaks, local scope, high resolution. But I also wanted to make a comment on the Trump administration's repeal of the current methane regulations. As we pointed out in our op-ed in the Houston Chronicle, this is not all bad news, because the existing EPA regulations were very much aimed at small leaks, and they had very exacting standards on the repairs that you needed to do on small leaks, but didn't say very much about large leaks. So while I'm highly in favor of methane regulations, I actually think it's a good time to rethink them in function of the evolutions in the technology that allow us to detect much larger leaks, because the small leaks need to be dealt with, but it's more important in the short term to deal with the large leaks again. I think that's it. And if you want to go to Q&A or whatever we do next without Antoine, let's go ahead. I'll do my best.
Yeah, I think we're still trying to get him into the webinar, because I know he definitely has a lot to add to this discussion, and hopefully we can get him in before we're done. That's the world we live in, the world of technical difficulties and being flexible and resilient.
Right.
Along those lines, I wonder if you could expand a little bit on because you just mentioned the rollback of the methane rules. And I think that's actually an important point that some people have, I don't think, a complete set of information on. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on what exactly was rolled back and how this opens the door, because you did suggest opportunity, and I agree with you, but I think maybe expanding on that point, how it does present an opportunity could be really good.
I think the existing methane regulations were very narrow in scope and very concentrated on oil field equipment, and addressed, if you like, repairing small leaks on valves and pipelines and things like that, but didn't actually address the major leaks associated with flaring gas or leaking pipelines, you know, in a very systematic way. So I think the opportunity is to shift the regulation to deal more effectively with the large leaks. And I'm not quite sure, well, until we have an administration, we're not quite sure how that's going to happen. But I definitely feel there's an opportunity there. And you will have seen that the Permian producers, a lot of them are already taking steps on their own without waiting for regulation. And I have to say that one of the factors that's really helped in the last year is the introduction of new infrastructure. Because obviously, every time you introduce an infrastructure that allows you to export the gas rather than just flare it in situ, it has a pretty dramatic effect on the methane emissions and all the GHG emissions generally. Absolutely.
So along those lines, because you did sort of hint at this in the remarks when you were presenting the slides, you know, new technologies are opening new doors for thinking about how to detect and ultimately regulate emissions. Do you think that the types of efforts that you're engaged with at Kairos, and I know your efforts are largely focused on helping companies figure out ways to solve the problems that they might have with their own infrastructure, but do you envision a world where you know, this technology spreads and becomes much more widely used by regulators?
Yes, and actually I would probably say that it's not just regulators, it's also investors. Because, you know, one of the things about climate change, which is lacking, is accurate measurement and reporting of individual people's or individual companies or countries' performance. And I don't think Kairos is the only answer. There are lots of other technologies that will need to be involved. But it will make life much simpler for investors to make decisions, regulators to make decisions, and companies to make decisions if there was some form of reasonably standard reporting based on accepted technology that everyone could refer to. And, you know, I think that we're still in very, very early days of that, you know, not just in the US, but all around the world. There are very few countries that have comprehensive systems of reporting. And of course, you have to remember that the oil and gas is not the only source of methane. You know, the mining industry is a source of methane. The cement industry is a source of methane. And then you have, you know, the natural sources of methane, be they wetlands, you know, cattle, all the rest of it. where actually, you know, we've been asked, could we measure the methane emissions from cattle? And it's impossible. I mean, the concentrations are not big enough. Big enough.
Sure.
I don't need to go into any details, Ken.
That's a story unto itself.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So a question actually that just came across, which I was going to ask, was I think it's an interesting thing to engage in, is really related to quantification. So is it possible with this technology to actually, and I don't know if you're actually already doing this or if there are algorithms in development to do this, but distinguish between types of leaks and how much is actually occurring. So if you're looking at production assets versus pipeline assets, what the quantity or the volume actually being emitted is, those kinds of things.
We can measure the volume that's being emitted, but it has a ceiling. In other words, we cannot, you know, from space go down to very small quantities. That's why I said that we were measuring large leaks or large clusters of leaks, because we can't actually go down without a great deal of work to an individual well, for example, in a place like the Permian where they're so concentrated. If you remember the example I gave of Sonatrach or the Gazprom example, those were very large leaks. In other words, you know, they are readily detectable and readily locatable through their size. And of course, we can measure through the algorithm, given the rate of the leak, the potential leak, the size of the leak until it's controlled.
Okay. So that actually got to a couple of different questions that have come up, looking at the resolution, for example, and you know what the scale of measurement potential is, et cetera. Now, if we sort of continue to develop technologies like this and think about higher resolution measurement, stuff like that, and we also think about policy remedies that might potentially be considered, and we don't know what those are, so there's no need to speculate on that. But I just wonder, from your own historical experience, right, in the oil and gas industry at Schlumberger, you know, now, yeah. How would you sort of measure best practice? What are the solution potentials that are out there? Is there a one-size-fits-all solution, or is it something that would be different by operator, do you think?
Sorry, I got my phone interrupted. Can you repeat the last bit, Ken?
Yeah, I said, in terms of solutions, is there a one-size-fits-all solution, or would it be something that would be different sort of by operator, scale of operations, et cetera?
I mean, I think for a measurement to be really useful, there has to be some standardization of how you measure or what the input is to the measurement, just like measuring porosity or permeability or anything else that you use in the oil field. You know, I think the technology will still dramatically improve. In fact, when we look at future satellite launches, we know that the accuracy is going to improve. The method of attribution and the method of plume dispersion, for example, these are all very complex algorithms. There is no regulatory standard to which we can marry ourselves today. And in fact, what we've done is seek the opinion of respected scientific institutes around the world. So we work a lot with the French, we work with the Japanese, we work with the Swiss, we work with the US, to the extent that the methodology we use in our algorithms is something that the scientists accept as being an accurate assessment of how it should be done. But today, there's no standard form that a regulator could adopt. And I think it'll be quite a long time before we get to that point, Ken. And it may not require the accuracy that we give for every single leak. It may be more a question of, you know, just say there's a ceiling. If we detect a leak above that ceiling, then people have to do something about it, or it has to be reported to a regulator.
Sure. So just as a clarifying question, the technology that you've deployed, one of our audience members asked how a company would use the data if it can't get down to a well level. But as I understood it, it can, right?
We can get down to a well level. If it's a well level, if it's, for example, we did do the exercise in a Permian on one well to be sure that we could do it. But wells are so tightly spaced in the Permian that the cost of going to each individual well would probably be prohibitive, you know, in terms of the amount of geolocation work you'd have to do in order to get there. But I think that what is more likely is, you know, if you have mostly, you know, well permits are readily identifiable to a particular operator. They tend to be concentrated in a particular area. A lot of the leases belong to one company and not other companies. I think it's far more likely in the place like the Permian with the very high concentrations that people ask us to give a picture of their acreage. You know, what do you see as the leakage from our acreage? And if we see anything really large, then we can say, hey, let us go and take a look at that well, you know. But spacing is such that I don't think it's likely we go to each individual well.
Sure. Now that makes sense. You're really just talking about marrying this with sort of more localized measurement techniques. Yeah, that actually makes sense.
Well, that's why there is a certain complementarity between what we do and what, for example, there's another company called Kairos who uses aircraft-mounted sensors to fly around the Permian, and they've done a lot of work already detecting methane. We would be extremely complementary in that we could say, hey, you know, there's a really large leak in X location. Go and take a look. You know.
Sure. How has what you're doing been received in other parts of the world? Because we know methane's not unique to the Permian or unique to California.
No. I mean, in fact, one of the worst offenders in the world is a country. It's Turkmenistan. You know, so I don't think I can say that we have country reactions yet. We do have company reactions, and you know, obviously a lot of the operators everywhere were initially a little suspicious of what are these guys going to do with this data, you know. And we've had to spend a lot of time saying, look, we want to try and try to help you to solve the problem. We're not going to try and shame you or finger point or, you know, or anything else. And so far, I would say that we're at the stage now where increasingly operators accept that the technology is accurate, one, and two, that it has value. And so we're moving forward into the commercial stage where people sign agreements, you know, for their specific interest in monitoring. I don't think I can say we have a single country reaction yet. Obviously, the example of measuring from space is you don't have to deal with local regulation the way you would if you wanted to fly an aircraft or a drone or anything else, you know. I mean, the idea of going to Russia and saying, I want to fly airplanes down your pipeline would not go over very well, right?
Right.
So there is an example, there is an advantage in doing it from space. But I can't say, honestly, we have a country reaction yet. We have company reactions. We have regulators who are starting to take an interest. But even more, it's the environmental lobby who is starting to take a serious interest in what this technology can do. And as I said before, this is in order to be able to influence investment practices.
Yeah, so you just mentioned that. I'll ask the question, and obviously you don't need to give any names because this is a commercially sensitive kind of thing. But in terms of the investment community, have you had any contact with banks or private equity investors or
no? What we did, if you're talking about for the use of our technology, we did a webinar in Europe where we had the head of BlackRock Alternative Investments from the London office, who basically manages the investment in all the alternative energy and environmental ETFs that BlackRock runs. He participated, and he was very excited about what the technology could do. We also had someone from EDF in the States who was on the same webinar. So they're interested in, you know, their interest now is how do we get this technology to the point where it becomes something useful that we can use in how to measure, you know, the ESG performance of individual companies. And that's where that's a little bit where the companies are going too. They want to be able to say, you know, this is my methane profile, and this is the extent to which I can decrease it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the ESG pressures are mounting, obviously, and we've actually seen some large banks make some pretty significant announcements with regard to how they're going to be viewing climate impacts of future investments. So I could see where something like this would be useful, is why I asked the question. A question came through, and it's really just, I think it's interesting because the map does not indicate leaks in certain parts of the world, Brazil and Nigeria in particular. Is that just because you have an image there, or?
Yeah, it's a question of where we've imaged and haven't imaged for the moment. Yeah, so I think Brazil would be the methane from oil and gas would be totally dwarfed by the natural methane, which we can't measure. And offshore is an issue because actually offshore there are far less methane emissions, and it's extremely difficult to measure because they disperse so quickly. You know, so offshore is a problem we're working on, but we're not close to it yet.
So do you have plans to image those parts of the world, or is this something to be driven by?
Yeah, we will eventually image wherever we think there's a major concentration. But you know, I mean, I'm actually not familiar with the program, where the program's going next, but I would imagine that what Antoine and the others have been trying to do is to image where they think it'll have the most effect in the short term with the ESG and the oil and gas community. I had a very nice letter from the CEO of Saudi Aramco, because in the op-ed for the Houston Chronicle, we pointed out how low Saudi's emissions were compared to the others. You know, so they are, you know, people are conscious of it, even if they're not yet using it. And he's comparing to his neighbors, of course, which is not so great.
Right, right. So you just touched on this, and maybe you can dig into the challenges a little bit more, but a question did come through about offshore methane emissions, even where there are clustered facilities. I mean, is this just really an issue of the local environment, winds, and dispersion, or is it also an issue?
I don't want to answer. I'm not the scientist myself, Ken. I know it's much more difficult than doing it on land. I know dispersion, plume dispersion is an issue. There is generally quite a lot of flaring offshore, so it must be fairly prevalent. But I suspect it, as we just said, it disperses so quickly, it's difficult to measure. But I'm sure, I know we're looking at it. I'm not sure at all when we'll have an answer.
Very good. So a question came through about, and this really gets to addressing the problems that you're identifying with the technology, and I think you can probably address this, but specifically, how expensive are leaks to fix, and how supportive in general across the oil and gas landscape have companies been with regard to closer measurement and what the product you have?
So, very broadly, leaks are quite cheap to fix, provided they're leaks. If they are conscious flaring and you have to create some form of export infrastructure or other use for the gas rather than flaring it, that obviously is a different economic proposition for the operators. Generally, the large operators are either extremely receptive or they are currently evaluating the technology and what the technology might do for them. I would say that not just our technology, but all the methane evaluation technologies, the large operators in the Permian, be they super majors or independents, are extremely conscious of the methane profile and their GHG profile generally, because while we've discussed the current abandonment of the EPA regulations, they have no doubt that it's going to come back. And it's going to be important to their profile, their ESG profile in the future. So I would say their interest is high. I think the issue is with the small operators who don't have access to infrastructure and who need to flare their gas in order to export the oil. And there I would describe the reaction so far as a deafening silence, Ken. But I think that the current state of the industry will sort that out to some extent anyway.
Fair point. Yeah, the ESG point it really resonates. We actually held an event earlier this summer that was co-sponsored with EDF, where we had a large Permian operator. It was focused on flaring, but as well as a member of a bank and a consulting company. It was really interesting how the discussion really centered on that aspect of being able to attract capital. It's really ESG investor guidance. And I think in many ways, that's an underappreciated point, particularly to the uninitiated for the gas industry, but the investment community is having a significant impact on what companies ultimately do.
Yeah.
So when, let me see, I had a question come through here that caught my eye, and then another one popped up. So, so when we talk about, so it's a question specifically on flaring, which is, obviously if you get full combustion, it's not a methane leak, but that doesn't always happen. So I wonder if you can address two things. First, if you do get a complete combustion, there's not sort of any unlit flares or anything like that. How does your technology how can you distinguish between different types of facilities if you have a flare that goes out versus, like, in other words, what I'm trying to get at is what's the time resolution? So can you actually identify in real time when operators are sort of, have an issue that they need to address and they can address it quickly, or is there a lag in terms of how data is gathered and assessed and ultimately shared with?
Well, it's not real time, but it is, if it's a passage of the satellite every 24 hours or 48 hours or 3 times a week or whatever, then it's pretty quick. And you can, between passages, see changes that have occurred. There is a question about the combustion of methane, which I don't have the answer to. I'll try and get it to you afterwards, but it's quite a complex consideration. Right. How much methane actually gets combusted when you're flaring?
Yeah, that's kind of what we're getting at. But
yeah,
I guess and then the second question I wanted to ask, because I thought this was an interesting one, because it's been an increasingly sort of common point of reference and concerns related to the oil price downturn. When we talk about abandoned wells or orphan wells, in many cases Andrew, did you hear me?
No, you kept cutting out, Ken. It was talking about abandoned wells, but I didn't get it.
So abandoned and orphaned wells, will the technology actually pick up relatively small leak rates from those types of facilities?
I doubt it. We're talking about big leaks here, but actually big leaks constitute such a large quantity of methane that, we're not concerned by that. But as I said earlier, drones or aircraft mounted sensors will pick up those small leaks where we don't. Did you hear that, Ken?
Great. Yeah. Sorry. So I did. Am I back now?
You're back.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'm actually at Rice. So whatever's going on with the internet is a big issue if it's affecting internet connection at Rice University. So, wow, what a day. An interesting question did come through, and I don't know if you've identified this, and it was one that I was going to ask anyway. In terms of where you're seeing the largest leak rates, I mean, we can talk about production facilities, we can talk about pipelines, we can talk about facilities near points of end use, but also LNG export and import facilities. Have y'all identified any of those types of, any differences across those types of facilities?
I mean, to be frank, the biggest two sources of leaks are production flaring and pipelines. Also, completion activity, as you know, considerably increases flaring during the putting on production and flowback period of the wells. And therefore, probably the decline in completion activity that we've seen, and in fact, we know this, in the recent months, has in fact had a positive effect on leaks. And the other thing which I mentioned earlier, which is very significant, and you can see it in the Permian emissions, not just methane, but greenhouse gas emissions, is the introduction of new pipelines. I mean, when the big pipeline came on last year, emissions dropped back to a level about 18 months earlier, just through the amount of gas that was going into the line instead of being flared. So, there are pretty dramatic swings that take place.
Yeah, you actually raise a point there that we've often had conversations about in different venues. Many people have actually, is the access to infrastructure. The ability to construct and site gathering and long distance transport infrastructure, and what that means for methane reduction. And it really highlights an interesting conundrum in the policy space, because it's ultimately a coordination problem. How do you make sure you have enough stuff to move what you're producing?
Absolutely.
I wonder if, and this is—
I would just add, Kate, that it hugely advantages the very big operators who can afford their own infrastructure.
Absolutely. And I guess that kind of brings us full circle back to the point about the rollbacks, the methane rollbacks. Because when you look at the landscape of who opposed and who didn't say anything or supported it, it's not 100%, but it's largely split between small and large operators. And I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit, maybe expand on it on the basis of cost and why you think that might have happened.
So, sorry, you're saying that the big operators were generally in favor and the small operators were more quiet?
No, exactly the opposite. The big operators have generally come out against the rollback of the methane rules, whereas the small operators have either been quiet or, been they were vocal in their displeasure of the rules that were recently rolled back. So,
I think it comes back to your ESG question. And I think it's very much linked to the fact that if you're a very large operator, very publicly visible, they know that your ESG, good heavens, we have Antoine. I think it comes back to the fact that they know that in the future their ESG performance is going to be a critical part of their public profile and their regulatory profile. And therefore, they don't want any rollback to happen. So as I pointed out, and Antoine can probably give you more detail, rolling back the EPA regulations as they existed was not a bad idea. It's a question of what gets put in.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I have a colleague at Columbia University who's a former employee of yours, Andrew, Robert Kleinberg, who's written a lot about this, and he submitted commentaries to the EPA, and he's just written some report on this issue. And indeed, the rules were extraordinarily prescriptive and required onerous equipments to monitor very precise parts of the facilities, but with a very low payoff. So a lot of effort to track very small emissions, missing the large emissions, missing the big picture and the big payoff.
Well, Antoine, it's good to see you. I'm glad you were able to join us finally.
Sorry, it's been incredibly frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah, it's It's the world we live in, right? Nothing but the unexpected. But it's good to see you. Glad you could join us. There was actually a couple of questions that came up that I'd love to get your thoughts on. One specifically was with regard to the technology that Kairos is using and the service that is being provided. regarding offshore production facilities. To what extent have you guys been looking at offshore facilities in terms of methane leak detection, and what issues are you being confronted with? We actually talked about the rate of dispersion of methane when you're offshore versus onshore, but what technical challenges exist, and how do you think you might be able to overcome those?
Right. So that's a tough question. Offshore is still a problem for us. So our technology doesn't pick up emissions offshore because of issues with the water surface interfering with the detection. So this is something we're working on, and it's in the pipeline, but it's not ready yet. Okay,
very good. No, that's good to know, because there were actually a couple of audience members that raised the exact same question. And then of course there was the issue of imaging everywhere in the world, because there didn't seem to be any methane detected in Brazil or Nigeria. I think one of our listeners pointed out. I wonder if y'all have a timeline that you're sort of looking at for evaluating everywhere, right, around the world, and then once you do, how frequent will that be, just as a general data gathering exercise, or will much of what you do end up being focused on commercial interest?
Right. Well, this is a work in progress. So right now we have a technology that compares orange and oranges using the same methodology for various occasions, and we pick up detections this way. But we're constantly working on new technologies. There's new satellites being launched. There's new options that open up constantly. So we expect to be covering more of the globe, and to cover other countries where today our rate of detection is suspiciously low. I would agree.
So a question I have, and either one of you can address this one. It's one that, so we're doing a bunch of work looking at. We have various carbon initiatives going on and greenhouse gas initiatives going on here, and one of the things that struck me in sort of looking at the work that you're doing, when you compare it to, for example, the EPA greenhouse gas inventory. There's a certain level of methane emissions that are reported, and as far as I understand, those are generally estimated based on a series of conversion factors, effectively. How do the numbers that y'all are gathering compare to those types of estimates?
Well, there's a big difference. So that's the value of the measurements that we bring. We're not trying to assess emissions based on engineered calculations, on assumptions about the rate of emissions per unit of equipment. This is actual measurements, actual detections, and the detections are much larger on average than was expected. We're picking up a large number of large emissions, whereas we only knew of a few incidents in the past.
That's interesting. So I did ask Andrew this, and he gave me a good answer just in terms of interest in the technology and how it's being applied. And I'm going to ask for a selfish reason. I imagine you've had similar conversations at Columbia about this, but how is the data that you're gathering, how is it being disseminated? Because once it's historical, right? Is there any way for an interested general party who's doing, general researcher to access that data in any way and do some work with it?
Well, we do have collaborations with a number of academic institutes. I don't know that we have one with Rice at the moment, but we certainly do collaborate with various academic centers, various research centers around the world. So we're very interested in sharing data and making our data available to fellow researchers. There's a lot of collaboration going on and needed really to advance the science and to move the needle in terms of removing emissions.
Sure, I think it would be a great way to also juxtapose that data in a historical sense with existing regulations, infrastructure developments, new drilling, and sort of be able to really ascertain what the marginal impact of all the different moving parts is with regard to methane emissions. I think it would be a fascinating thing to do. Go ahead.
Well, it is striking. I'm sure Andrew maybe made that point already, but we're picking up detections in countries that typically have a fairly low level of regulations. So in countries where there's very high standards in regulations or operating practices, not surprisingly, we're not picking up a lot of emissions. A case in point would be Saudi Arabia. We're not detecting a lot of emissions in Saudi Arabia. Actually, it's kind of a benchmark in terms of good operations, and this is, I think, closely correlated to the policy that's been in vigor in the kingdom to capture the gas and not flare and not vent and capture the gas for power generation.
Sure. So I'll ask a kind of forward-looking question, if you will. With regard to how technology's been developing, and we kind of touched on the edges of this already when it was just before you joined. But with regard to how the technology's been developing, do you see a point in the very near future where these types of measurement techniques will be used not only by operators, not only by pipeline operators, oil and gas companies, but also by banks, members of the investment community, to really drive home some of the ESG commitments that have been made to measure, monitor, and act responsibly with regard to methane?
Indeed, very much so. I think it's important that measurements be provided as a third-party assessment, not purely for private operating purposes. So there's obviously value in providing information to companies so that they can detect their emissions, improve their operating standards. But I think the true value is the independent validation that we can provide to what companies report themselves, or we can provide companies with a way of validating their claims, of providing verification of what they said they're doing. And I think for ESG-minded investors, which are now becoming the vast majority of investors, it's going to be very critical to have these independent measurements and also standardized measurements that apply the same rules, the same standards across companies, so that we can really compare the operations of companies on the same basis.
Yeah, I think that's to me, that's one of the most fascinating parts about this in the entire ESG movement. The pressures that are being exerted on the industry is, in many ways, it's a much more powerful force than regulation could be, just because you're talking about access to the lifeblood of the company, right? Whatever part of the value chain you're in. And so I think it's an interesting one to watch, and it's amazing what transparency does, right? It's
absolutely. And I think the future is that really emissions are going to be a key differentiator in terms of pricing equities and pricing commodities. And in order to do that, you have to have independence and third-party measurements.
Absolutely. We are actually getting close to time. I'm sorry for all of the technical difficulties. We had a few of our own hiccups while we were waiting for you to join, Antoine. Actually, Andrew got kicked out because of internet instability issues at Memorial, and we had some pauses here at Rice as well, which is bizarre, but I guess that's just, like I said, a sign of the times. I want to thank you both, for taking the time to join me on this webinar. We'll have to do it again at some point when things are a little bit more stable, particularly as you start to see some of what you're doing evolve and move forward and really be taken up, and then we can actually discuss the ultimate impact it's having on operations in the field and along the pipeline. So thank you both again very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very sorry that I only showed up for the concluding minutes.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah.
No problem. No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.